Hello and welcome back to the 135 lecture series. So many of you have used the word native speaker to talk about people who speak English as a first language. But you may have also used the word Native American, and you still meant somebody who speaks English as their first language. There's actually a big difference between a native English speaker and a Native American. So a native English speaker is someone like me who speaks English as their first language. But a Native American is the first group of people to live in the Americas. So that's very different than a native English speaker. So today we're going to look at some information about the Native Americans and their history. So let's talk for a minute about who really discovered America. So what you may not know is that America was discovered thousands of years ago. So the Native Americans actually, they first lived in Asia. And at this time, now this was more than 12,000 years ago, Asia was connected to North America by a thing called the Bering Strait. And so it was kind of like a bridge made of ice and land. So what happened was these people in Asia very slowly made a journey across this bridge of ice and land from Asia over to Alaska, down Canada, all the way into what is now the United States, and some continued further south into Central and South America. And they lived there for thousands of years. Then, about 500 years ago, Christopher Columbus discovered America. So why I say that is because there were already people living there, and they had lived in America for thousands of years. But the Europeans did not know that the Americas existed. So Christopher Columbus was actually, he was an explorer from Spain, and he wanted to find a faster way to get to India. And he thought that maybe if he sailed west, he would reach India faster. So he got in his ship and he sailed west across the Atlantic Ocean. And he landed on an island that is near Florida. And he saw these people who had brown skin and dark hair, and he thought he was in India. So he called the people Indians. And for many, many years, actually, this term Indians was used to describe these people who we now call the Native Americans. So let's talk about the Native Americans in what is now the United States. So 500 years ago, there were about 10 million Native Americans who lived in the United States, and they lived in tribes. So a tribe is a large group of people like a nation. So each tribe had its own culture and religion and political system, and each tribe also had its own language. So you can see on the map here some of the different tribes that lived in the United States. And at that time, 500 years ago, there were about 250 different languages being spoken by the Native Americans who lived in the United States. And it's important to know that none of those languages were English. So English was not spoken in the United States until after the Europeans arrived. So let's talk a little bit more about the different cultures that these tribes had. So there were some tribes who were farmers. So they farmed the land, they planted things, they grew vegetables, they also hunted, and they lived in very well-organized villages with political systems. And you can see here an example of some of the housing that some of these Native Americans had in this picture on the left. So this is called a pueblo. And this is what some of the Native Americans down in the southwestern United States lived in. And it looks kind of like today's apartment buildings. So people who lived in houses like this, they didn't move around. They stayed and they farmed the land. Now, there were also some tribes that we call hunters and gatherers. And these tribes would actually move around, okay? So they didn't just stay in one place. They would move around to hunt animals and to gather food So they would take the food, instead of growing vegetables themselves, they took it from the forest or sometimes from these other tribes that farmed. So those people are nomadic. So by nomadic, I mean they didn't stay in one place. So they needed a different kind of house. So on the right here, you can see a picture of another kind of house that the Native Americans had. So these are houses for nomadic people, and it's called a teepee, and it was very easy and fast to build and take down. So as they needed to move around the country to follow the animals and to gather more food, they could just take down their house and move and then rebuild it. So now let's talk about what happened when the Europeans first arrived. It's important to understand that at this time in history, the Europeans felt superior or better than the other races. And different European countries were all trying to build their own empire, like the Romans. So they wanted to leave Europe and get more land and take these people. A lot of times they took the people as slaves and then used the land for themselves. So as they came to the Americas, they're trying to take this land to build a bigger empire. So they first arrived in the northeastern United States in what is now Massachusetts in the early 1600s. And it's very cold in the northeastern United States. And these Europeans really did not know how to survive this weather. And the Native Americans taught them how to farm and survive and live off the land. So the Europeans really had a lot to be thankful for, that the Native Americans came in and welcomed them and helped them. And the Native Americans felt like, there's a lot of land. The United States was huge. So they felt like there's plenty of land to share. So what happened? How did the Europeans thank the Native Americans? Well, they killed them. They killed them in a lot of different ways. So for starters, the Native Americans had never had contact with diseases from Europe. So many Native Americans died just because of these new diseases that their bodies could not fight. So for example, smallpox, a disease that came over from Europe, killed lots of Native Americans. Now, some Native Americans did survive these diseases, and the Europeans started to push them out of their land, and we call this displacement, right? So they're putting them into a new place. So the Europeans said, I want this land, I need you to move. And sometimes the Native Americans didn't want to move, so they stayed and they tried to fight the Europeans. Now what happened was it really was not a fair fight because of technology. So the Europeans had guns, and the Native Americans did not have guns. They had bows and arrows and spears. So their technology to fight was it wasn't a fair match. So they often died and lost these battles. It was really difficult for the Native Americans to win a battle against the Europeans. So the Europeans killed thousands, millions of Native Americans and pushed them out of their land so that they could take the land for their country back in Europe. So maybe for Spain or for France or for England. So it was a pretty ugly past that happened in America. So you may be wondering, are there any Native Americans left? And the answer is yes, there are. There are about 5 million Native Americans who still live in the United States. And 5 million that sounds like a big number, but that's only 2% of the total population in America. So most of America was very successfully taken over by the Europeans. And what's unfortunate is that those 5 million Native Americans have a much higher rate of poverty and unemployment than white Americans. Now, some people are working hard to try to save the Native American cultures and try to write down their languages so that they're not lost, because we do realize that there is a lot of value in Native American culture, and it is not something that we should lose. Well, that's all the time we have for today. I hope you learned a lot, and good luck with the rest of your exam.